Hello, everyone. Oh my gosh, I'm a little too tall for this microphone. I'm a little too tall for most things. For those of you I've never met before, my name is Jennifer Krasinski. I'm on faculty here at SVA's MFA in Art Writing program. And on behalf of myself, David Levi Strauss, our chair, Annette Wehrhahn, our assistant chair, and the rest of the faculty and students, I want to welcome you here tonight to our first Quixote talk of the spring semester with Ariel Goldberg. One quick thing, if you could please silence your cell phones. I always forget to say that, so tonight I'd like not to forget. As many of us sitting in this room know all too well, thinking is a messy business. It is at times an unwieldy, overwhelming activity, and writing can feel like an inefficient attempt at cleaning up its aftermath, polishing it for the reader in order to make sense of the world. As Ariel declares in the opening pages of the Estrangement Principle, the occasion of their thinking and writing for this book was initially sparked in part by frustration, disappointment, irritation with regard to the label queer art, and with the unresolved limitations and questions of what that means, what it doesn't mean, what it says or leaves unsaid. What Ariel has produced in turn is an astoundingly generous and generative text, one that resonates deeply because it is, at its core, a model for thinking and writing as a mode of resistance. To resist definition, to resist easy reductions, easier deductions, to resist labels and certain seductive traps of language, to resist even one's own habits of mind, in the pursuit not just of knowledge or answers, but in the pursuit of a nuanced, multivalent, roiling, forceful articulation of the nuanced, multivalent, roiling, forceful condition in which one may find oneself. As the title suggests, one of the book's many achievements, at least to my mind, is how it flexes the power of estrangement. Whether that estrangement is understood as a cultural imposition or political position, a point of view or a point in time, which feels these days, perhaps most acutely, a necessary and much needed fuel for forward momentum. As to the nuts and bolts of Ariel's achievements, they are not only a writer, but they are also an artist and a curator. They're the coordinator of the Friday night reading series at the Poetry Project, which features hybrid interdisciplinary works, thereby giving a platform to those writers, artists, and others who blur or dissolve the lines between genres, whose efforts, in effect, can't be neatly labeled. In addition to the Estrangement Principle, they're the author of The Photographer, which was published by Roof Books in 2015. Ariel's writing, research, and performances have received the support of many, including the New York Public Library, the Headland Center for the Arts, and the Franklin Furnace Fund, just to name a few. Ariel is also an educator, as some of you well know, who teaches at Parsons, the New School, Pratt, and at NYU's Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts. And with that very brief introduction, I want you please to help me welcome Ariel Goldberg.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you all for being here. It's amazing to come together, and I know there's lots of places to be. So thank you for that. I'm really honored to be in a program that fosters art writing as somebody who sort of taught themselves how to do that. In the process of writing this book, it feels really sweet. So this is a photo that I took in my studio, I don't know, in the early days of working on this book. It took me about 5 years to write this book, more or less, kind of like 6 with all the editing, which is a long time. And I just found this microphone. I had a bunch of microphones. I was really obsessed with making performance art using microphones as like a symbolic object. And I just made a triangle with some nails that were already in the wall, and that sort of hung over me. So I'll leave that there until we get to some other slides. So I'm going to read from 2 chapters of the Estrangement Principle, maybe 3, and then I also wrote some new notes. They're notes, not finished text, really. Trying to think about my book right now in this moment. I'm drawn to the moments of conflict in histories of movements precisely because most self-proclaimed collectives emerge at the sight of a rupture between the work they're doing and the work of a nearby status quo. In Lynn Hirschman Leeson's documentary, Women Art Revolution, she interviews artist Martha Wilson, who recounts a visit to Judy Chicago's feminist art program. I showed photographs of myself dressing as a man, this is Martha Wilson speaking, trying to look like a woman, photographs using makeup to beautify and then to deform my face. And then Judy said, well, what do you think of the work that you see here? And there were flowers and breasts all over the walls, and I thought it was hideous. So I said, it looks prescriptive to me. And then she said, don't you understand what we're trying to do here? We're trying to support these young women. So I started crying. Laughs. I completely lost it. I couldn't believe a feminist could act like this. Wilson changes her tone of voice to a throaty roar when she speaks Chicago's words, and how Chicago antagonized Wilson at her suggestion of honest conversation about the art. Judy Chicago deemed her students' work too vulnerable for criticism. The fear of dissolution because of critique is a common thread in young movements that are, ironically, trying to solidify a critique of a dominant culture. The fact that Wilson was surprised a white feminist could act like this also exposes her assumption that feminists all act one way, or that white feminists were immune from reproducing power structures they were supposedly liberated from. Instead of using a movement model, Black Toque Collective, which was formed by Dawn Lundy Martin, Duriel Harris, and Ronaldo Wilson in 1999, wrote a call for dissonance, which ignites inquiry alongside aesthetic alliances. In Black Toque's manifesto, they ask a series of questions as opposed to making definitive statements. And I write about that at more length in the book. Cheryl Clark, in her book After Mecca, Women Poets in the Black Arts Movement, provides an image of, quote, constantly redrawn circles as maps for entering subjective constructions of art movements. Often pertinent histories lie outside of a movement's bounds and therefore need to be constantly redrawn. Lisa Gale Collins' essay, The Art of Transformation, Parallels in the Black Arts and Feminist Arts Movements, notes that both were the cultural corollary wings of Black power and women's liberation, respectively. Collins traces similarities structurally and tactically between the two movements that include anthologies, group shows, cultural leaders, theorists, and manifestos. Both movements notably had a national scope. I am relieved that Collins' methodology would be impossible to follow if one were to ask, is there a queer arts movement? This question appears, I hope, only in a nightmare I had about a standardized test version of this book. I also want to say, if there are seats in the front here, and I'm staring at them out of the corner of my eye. You're doing the book table, Hakeem. Okay. Inside the current reality that gay liberation has been hijacked by upper middle class white agendas focused on assimilation and single issues, Queer Nation's manifesto from the early 90s, which was written at the height of the AIDS epidemic, which is not over, says, you as an alive and functioning queer are a revolutionary. And this feels constantly up for debate. Is being queer revolutionary? It really depends. Self-identified queer artists often resist assimilationist, homo-nationalist rhetoric. Yet this becomes very difficult to trace and back up because the word queer has come to stand in for so many things, for so many different people. Chris Vargas and Greg Euman's web series, Falling in Love with Chris and Greg, which now sort of appears defunct, this is a screenshot of their website, altered an episode of the reality TV show Work of Art, The Next Great Artist, to illustrate this problem of the word queer as easily collapsible within the gay mainstream. Falling in Love with Chris and Greg is an occasional web series that began in 2008 and depicts a self-effacing caricature of an odd couple. Chris encourages processing everything from going off hormones to trying an open relationship. Greg plays the whiny, slightly uptight liberal gay whose debt is real from endless time in graduate school. For example, in the Hair Breakdown special, Greg is seen reading from dissertation to book in bed, and that book in real life of Greg's is Word Is Out, a queer film classic, which is a whole book about the first documentary film about gay people. I don't know if it was the first, but it was a seminal one. Anyway, each episode of Work of Art, on the other hand, the reality TV show, begins with the judges presenting the contestants with a time-sensitive challenge. The reality show is both devoid of irony and ripe with absurdity. Vargas and Humans do a semi-slick video editing to make an episode of Falling in Love with Chris and Greg by inserting themselves into Work of Art's pop art challenge. I'm just curious, has anyone seen Work of Art, the reality TV show? Okay, so it's a reality TV show kind of about artists competing with each other, basically. And this is them editing themselves, Chris and Greg editing themselves into the footage of the reality TV show, which they, I guess, like sort of downloaded and messed with. And you can see in the background is the challenge being set up to them, which is all of these Andy Warhol soup cans for the pop art challenge. The appropriated footage as backdrop begins with the suspenseful music leading up to a description of Andy Warhol's soup can installation at the Phillips Auction House, which is an important location. Vargas and Humans paste in scenes of themselves as contestants in Work of Art. They overwrite the flimsy pop art movement with the challenge to fulfill the terror pleasure in the prompt to make a, quote, successful piece of queer art about failure. Chris's piece is a meta-critique of the competitive structure of reality TV shows, which now has all new meaning. He speeds up and loops a clip of Chaz Bono appearing in Dancing with the Stars. Chris appears well-trained in the elevator pitch, telling a judge on the show, Simone, during a surprise studio visit that his work is about, quote, trans people in the public eye and how mainstream media represents trans people. Chris's explanation of his work is rendered illegible. He does not try to win the affection of the guest judge, who uses the wrong pronoun for Chaz Bono, then asks if it's true if you can tell a tranny by looking at the feet to know for sure. He instead uses Simone's transphobic response to his piece by titling it Small Hands, Small Feet. Chris's studio space, as you can see, is adorned with well, you can't see the rainbow mug, but it's in his hand. A rainbow mug, a pink triangle hanging on the wall, which is a hint of sort of promotion for the insignia of Chris Vargas's real-life Museum of Transgender History and Art with the acronym MOTHA. Greg decides to draw scenes of queer failure with colored pencil, not exactly mastering depth of field. He puts celebrities in awkward, lonely, or distressing moments. One drawing depicts Anthony Perkins feeling enervated and watching, quote, cheesy gay movies with sexy boys on Netflix. While Perkins is drawn home viewing in bed on his laptop, a sort of lollipop guild of an Occupy protest is going on outside of his window. Another drawing depicts Joel Grey standing in a long line for a free cheesecake sample at Costco. It is really funny. It's a 13-minute video art, and it's available online. I recommend you watch it. Greg's work is slightly more legible to Simone, perhaps because it features a white male subjectivity, though Greg laughs off the visible likeness of the figures in his drawings to himself. In their satire, Vargas and Humans retain Work of Art's original plot of the contestant young son Hans' coronation for making a true work of art, with the dubbed line, "Your piece will look amazing on the pages of Corporate Gay Weekly." Han wins the queer art and the pop art challenge, rendering the buzzwords interchangeable. Falling in Love with Chris and Greg provides a playful critique of naming art queer. Conversely, this piece could be read as a case for queer art as the next pop art, which I think we already see sort of unfolding. This is young son Han's piece. Making fun of queer art in a web series does not disrupt its commodification. It only strengthens it. The critique Vargas and Newman's launch is towards Han's winning piece, a benign advertisement neither for nor against an enormous pink and purple glossy logo that reads Prop 8, which invites viewers to scribble with multicolored Sharpies on the poster's backside as if visiting a tourist attraction. Han tells the cameras in his confessional, because it's a reality TV show, about how gay marriage is a personal issue for him as a gay man. He also talks about wanting to make safe art that does not take a position, about the ban against gay marriage in California, which passed on the voter ballot in 2009 and has since been declared unconstitutional. So like when gay marriage was made illegal, and then it was legal, and then it was nationally legal. It gets a little tricky, but this Prop 8 was like an anti-gay marriage thing. The queer artists on the show lose the challenge that they edited themselves into in order to show a contrast against a gay artist who wants to assimilate into an American heteronormative dream. Chris and Greg go home, quote unquote, in the double elimination round to symbolically return to being misunderstood by television's mainstream. These two queer artists notably represent opposing attitudes, the enthusiast Greg and the cynic Chris. Their illegibility both safeguards queer art within the reductive art market and critiques the capitalist system of appointing a single winner who takes home one big cash prize. Their rage and vulnerability do not make them immune to the market. They almost won. When tasked with the high stakes of survival and funding, are the artists even to be blamed for competing? And this is a slide from the original work of art where Jerry Saltz was a guest judge. And this is when the sort of the illusion cracks. That I've watched this many times with people, and people usually can't tell that the video editing is happening. Like, it looks real. The video editing is really good. Like, it looks like they were actually on the show that they edited themselves into. Like, they were really contestants. And but then, you know, when these, you know, the credits start to roll, and it's like thanking Radar Productions, which is a nonprofit that funds and supports through a writer's retreat and a reading series in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's Michelle T. founded the nonprofit, and it explicitly funds queer artists. Allie Liebgott, Beth Pickens, all these other people I'm having a hard time reading, and also decolonized movements, transgender people everywhere and forever. So you can kind of see what this contrast of who they're thanking in their credits, that they're doing some sort of intervention. Now I don't know where I was. Oh, here we are. Every and any artist who is queer is doing the cultural corollary work that Lisa Gale Collins outlines as the bedrock of social movements. Some artists label their work as representing various modes of identification. Some artists refuse labels. Some artists vacillate between labeling and not labeling their work. Many artists will be labeled in ways they would never personally utter. There are institutions that are designed to promote art with certain identifications. There are people without access to those institutions who may or may not start their own institutions, but will never call themselves institutions. There are other institutions that prioritize artists who identify similarly to how the leader of that institution identifies. The expression queer art is most broken when considered in the context of its default prioritization of one identity over other identities, which always prompts the question, who has been privileged with historically unlabeled subject positions? James Baldwin establishes on the first page of his 1956 novel Giovanni's Room the whiteness of his protagonist, David, and how his expatriate journey from New York to Paris marked a reversal of the path of the colonialists. And I just wanted to throw in a picture with some James Baldwin pictures. Ongoing inspiration. It's disorienting for me to encounter what is increasingly termed queer art, and to find so rarely in these encounters the writers that I champion in the Estrangement Principle. I find the macro machine of the art world institutions so far out of sync with the micro rhythms of writers who support other writers, because that is often the only way that experimental writers' work survives. So I pointedly asked this question, where is Renee Gladman? Where is Pamela Liu? Where is Tisa Bryant? Where is Rachel Levitsky? Where is Stacy Samazik? And the list goes on, but those are just some of the writers that I write about in the book. And I asked these questions when I was visiting Carlos Mota's We Who Feel Differently exhibition in New York. Mota's glossy 3D archive was installed in 2012 at the Erie condo-style top floor of the new museum, the educational area of the museum. The installation included a series of benches in front of half a dozen screens and headphones that were playing a loop of 50 video interviews that Mota conducted about LGBTIQQ politics and cultural production. The interviews feature well-known activists, academics, doctors, lawyers, artists, writers, and curators from 4 different countries: Colombia, South Korea, Norway, and the United States. The benches in the installation shared the floor's rainbow carpeting as if they were the rolling hills of a comfortable classroom. Books positioned as queer classics sat on the benches, laminated for public durability. So there's a lot of documentation of the We Who Feel Differently installation, and I'll go into more details about the project. I don't have like a slide of every single aspect of it. It's a really multifaceted project, but I recommend you checking it out online. You can find it easily through Carlos Mota's website, and I believe it's wehowfeeldifferently.info. And it's a really pretty amazing archive, and the project has traveled to many different countries, has been translated into many languages and installations. Mota calls We Who Feel Differently a database documentary that exists as a traveling installation, symposium, events programming, website, library, sporadic journal, and book. And then I have the book here. These physical and online containers for We Who Feel Differently increase people's access to the project beyond the temporary exhibition. Mota's database documentary challenges what is lacking from the mega institution by creating its own version of an archive. The keyword difference of the project's title elucidates a resistance to both heteronormative culture and the mainstreaming of gay rights to assimilate into that culture. The book version of We Who Feel Differently is composed of chapters that reflect recurring themes in the interviews. Carlos Mota and his sister Christina Mota co-edited the 50 opinionated voices from the interviews that are inside the installation, and they basically sewed them together. They sewed together these 50 different excerpts from the interviews by introducing them with these sort of ellipses that are then encased in parentheses. So I have a close-up here of how this is laid out, so we can see, speaking about the value of art as a register of blah, 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 of what wants to remain hidden. Katz affirms. So there's like a very, very brief sort of introductory clause that summarizes the main ideas of what the interviewee said. And then there's this punctuation that I found really interesting of a quotation mark, a parentheses, and then 3 ellipses, and then the quote begins. And the whole book, if I can pass it around, maybe that would be helpful, because I had a lot of people read this part of the book, and they were like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so I'm aware that this might seem slightly illegible, which I'm committed to. It's okay. But if you just, I'll boil it down for you really one more time. The book is mostly interviews. There's very little there's very little editorial writing inside of it, but there are these sort of you come up for air with these sort of distillations of what's happening and these summaries. Okay. So the book version of We Who Feel Differently is composed of chapters that reflect recurring themes in the interviews. The interviewer's voice are reorganized as if to submerge readers in the overlapping conversations of a crowd. A new voice is often introduced into the mix with just one summarizing sentence that includes their name, title, and location. The vast majority of the book consists of quotations which are laid out as consecutive paragraphs and present the text as an achievement of continuity as opposed to discord. The sewing together of interviews in the book questions authorship while toying with the danger of the first-person plural. When I first read We Who Feel Differently, the book, I found myself consistently losing track of who is being quoted when. Mota's project upholds the documentary idiom, producing the side effect of wondering, where's the director's voice? So in this chapter titled Queering Art Discourse, an air of light manifesto pervades the editorial introduction, which defines queer art tentatively, in quotes, as a notion of an art that represents, names, discusses, engages, and insists on sexual difference. What the editors name as queer art, and the Motas capitalize the phrase queer art, has been silenced and censored by the status quo, the art market, and institutions. Ironically, of course, Mota's work is very present within art institutions, galleries, museums, etc. Yet propaganda for queer art that is at risk of being censored only advocates for art with definitive queer content on its surface. Because there are such different and unarticulated languages being used to talk about queer subject matter, we must be hyper-aware of how the "don't censor us for our gay sex content" argument could easily render work with queer subject matter among other subject matters seemingly non-existent. Visibility is not the goal for many, but if visibility means being shoved within a context of white heteronormativity, then it is not the goal. Mota's project broadly examines the problem of invisibility of queer subject matter across 4 countries' historical social contexts in 2011, which is important to note that date. The overarching goal of my project and the Estrangement Principle is to problematize the notion of queer subject matter by looking closely at work that may not be visibly queer, while remaining powerful because it is not always explicitly marked as queer. I'm reminded of how, in 2014, the Strand bookstore tucked wide rainbow-colored bookmarks, and I found these pictures on my cell phone. Wide rainbow-colored bookmarks into those titles whose authors are known to be gay. June is Gay Pride Month, a separate sign explains. I noted that Renee Gladman's books would probably not get that rainbow bookmark. Then again, at a bookstore like Strand, and I also think this is changing since the time I wrote this, that I rarely see experimental prose writers featured on display tables. I'm reminded of my excitement upon finding Renee Gladman's zine Clamor, which a whole chapter of my book is about, where I close read the 3 years that this zine existed, 1996 to 1999 in San Francisco, that Renee Gladman edited, and how she called this a dyke zine. And I watch what tempers my exuberance around the word queer, the suspicion that the word will be synonymous with white gay guys or people who enjoy privileges of cisgender heterosexuality. On the other hand, the word queer crucially includes and affirms non-binary and trans people in ways that the word dyke historically has not. So I took some pictures of the books that I saw that had the rainbow in them. Dennis Cooper, Michael Cunningham, John Waters, James Baldwin, Giovanni's Room, mentioned earlier. And then, this is my favorite, I couldn't see what book this was. So it could be a Gertrude Stein book, we don't know. We could just conjecture. Okay, so I found a striking similarity in the multiplicity of voices in Mota's database documentary to a polyvocal experimental prose book such as Renee Gladman's The Activist, which was published in 2003. The plotline in The Activist mutates as a contested piece of information. The state claims that a group of activists known as the CPL, and I will warn you, I'm going to do like a sort of summary and close reading of some parts of the activists now. So we're going, and I don't have like scans of book pages. I just have this sort of small image. This is the publisher, Krupskaya. And this is one of the venues that sells Krupskaya's books, small press distribution. The plotline in The Activist mutates as a contested piece of information. The state claims that a group of activists, known as the CPL, is responsible for a bridge exploding. Another group, called the Commuters, claim the bridge is still there. The activists' rotating narrators often struggle with being stuck at a periphery. The activists find it difficult to communicate clearly with one another while plotting anti-capitalist actions. Their story is told out of sequence and often subject to the interference of the vague and distrustful media. The Activist, as a book, is primarily a commentary on how, and this is a quote from Gladman, a plan to stop the swarm of corporate America, quote unquote, might go awry. In the chapter Radical's Plan, the uncomfortable leader of the group, Monique Wally, does not know how to articulate that the map of downtown is disappearing as they look at it. To tell them that the line on this map representing 3rd Street has just vanished will cause them to lose faith in me. And this was our most overt action. It will fail if encumbered by disbelief. I have to get us back on track. And that's Monique Wally. When she's narrating. Gladman's writing often ruminates on how the authoritative line-drawing replica of a city is suspicious, as is consolidating power into a single leader. The highly abstracted fiction of maps prepares readers for Gladman's proclivity for recreating the directionless ramble. Many of her books feature narrators just sort of walking around cities lost. The bridge in the book, There and Not There, suggests how unconnected activist struggles can feel both from dominant culture and from one another, much like the dissolution and tenuous coalition building in Lizzie Borden's 1983 film Born in Flames. Toward the end of The Activist, Monique and Stephanie are apart from the CPL while under a sort of sex-infused house arrest. So these are two members, Monique the leader and Stephanie a member of the CPL activist group. The lesbian action here is extremely understated. The lovers don't leave bed even though there are no groceries in sight and the phone is continuously ringing. Gladman has this distinct ability to make readers forget what just happened. Her books create the feeling of waking up from a dream, the details of which have just slipped away. Her body of work sticks to the plan of a disappearing map. The activist sense of individuality enters a final blur with their sociality when the plot gravitates toward personal desires that nudge their way into the political organizing. Unlike Carlos Mota's database documentary, where he relates to his subjects with a cool and professional distance, like in a traditional documentary film, he presents his interviewees as strong leaders. Gladman, on the other hand, portrays her activists with extreme intimacy to highlight their vulnerabilities. Often, Gladman's activists are tired, hungry, or drugged, which results in an apparent lack of coherence in their plan. The reader is left unsure of whether the government is even responsible for the interrogation-induced drugging, or if members of the group are just hungover. And there are scenes of both parties of the group and of really intense interrogations where there has been drugging happening and torture. Gladman similarly shows Monique Wally's struggle with lucidity as the group's leader. Monique is baffled when she successfully rouses her group and its growing followers to action. The political action notably remains suggestively mysterious, perhaps taking place outside the book's narrative. The unrelenting support from lovers and friends performs the main event of the book's conclusion. So I returned to this question that I had when I first entered the We Who Feel Differently installation, which is, why wasn't the activist on one of the benches inside of this sort of queer library that was being formed? And why was it also, even further, not featured on a queer bibliography page on the We Who Feel Differently website? Because this project, the Carlos Mota's We Who Feel Differently project, is so vast, it has a bibliography also on that website. We go all the way back there. Yeah, so if you go to like one of those tabs, like About or something, or Ephemera, you can find a bibliography of queer books. So We Who Feel Differently is adamantly not a survey. The bibliography, in full transparency, announces that it is compiled from solicitations and suggestions. So it is totally impossible to include everything. And the margins of the supposed queer margins will shift for everyone, guaranteed. Considering that disclaimer, my expectation for a larger presence of experimental prose writers in Mota's project, such as Renee Gladman, whose form may at times obscure the presence of lesbian, queer, trans, gay content, seems pretty unfair. But I couldn't shake it either. So I emailed Carlos Mota while writing this chapter, over the many years that I was writing this chapter, to suggest all the authors that I champion in this book. And he graciously responded and told me that he would add them to the bibliography. So I'm not interested in offering a revised canon because canons have historically acted like deaf hierarchies. So how to make the rereading of a zine from the late 90s or the studying of a very ambitious database documentary such as Mota's something active, moving, and approachable? Those are my main questions. Projects that resemble anthologizing highlight how queer artists are culled from very different artistic lineages. As Elizabeth Alexander writes, the gathering impulse of who's in and who's out is more a portrait of the editor than anything else. To conclude her essay, The Black Poet as Canon Maker, Langston Hughes and the Road to New Negro Poets USA, Alexander writes, the anthology offers a vision of the creative landscape a writer wishes to live in and wants to foster. The anthology is akin to the living room, the inner self revealed through the presentation of the representative space. Okay. So inclusion and exclusion are faulty frameworks. It just depends on who is reading or who is talking. And luckily, there are a lot of people reading and talking. So those are two sections from chapters in the Estrangement Principle. And then I was feeling incredibly restless. I couldn't resist not including this picture that I'll just say is from a Peter Hujar book of portraits, and photographer who is no longer with us, and he had a portrait of Fran Lebowitz that I was looking for because I was interviewing Fran, and this is the sort of end of the book, is where I talk about that interview. And I was looking for this picture of her in this book, and I couldn't find it, and it was in fact ripped out by somebody. It was a library copy of the book. So, and this is the picture that I was looking for. Some of it's the one with her in bed and with that crazy wallpaper. Then there's other pictures of Fran. So it just in the last 10 minutes okay? Okay, I'm okay on time. We're almost through this. So I wanted to challenge myself to think through some of the things that I'm thinking about this week in relationship to just basically having a microphone and you all sitting here so graciously and generously listening to me. So I was also thinking about a conversation that a lot of my book is about, like points of contact with people and conversations. And I had the honor of being interviewed by Jennifer Krasinski, who invited me here, for this amazing Village Voice article that she wrote about the Poetry Project, where I've been working for 4 years, because it's our 50-year anniversary. And we started talking about this thing, and I wanted to sort of write a little bit more about it for the occasion of this talk and think about it in relationship to the book. So when institutions decide on trends, what is that about versus when they indicate working towards substantial, long-term support and structural change? So that's the sort of question that I've been sitting with this week. How to move from the trend to long-term change. And we're facing some really serious but not unprecedented shit because the gears have been churning for vast privatization for a long time. And many corners of the art world have already been privatized. I'm standing in front of inside of a private institution right now. I work for private institutions. One argument of the Estrangement Principle is it's kind of an ask. It's basically asking like the art world writ large, which isn't to say there aren't artists who aren't paying attention, but for the art world to pay more attention in depth to experimental writers. And I'm talking about this sort of reality that poets are rarely household names in this country, and that relative notion of like a queer person's invisibility or illegibility is not so different than an experimental poet's invisibility, is a sort of idea that I put forth in the book. And of course, not being visible is also a great source of power, especially in this time when the state is trying to collect information about us. So when they cut the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, not to mention the slew of other threats to human rights we are facing, how do we produce art without funding? And I think we can look towards artists who are queer or the experimental poets who have never gotten that funding because their content was feared and illegible. There are practical skills that have been developed in our country's historic refusal of people's work. And we need to think historically and look towards how people have sustained communities of artists and writers without any racist board members involved, without a federal grant, without corporate sponsorship, without a blue chip gallery, without real estate developers buying you out of your already overpriced apartment. We need to look towards artists who are queer or whose literary works have been, like I've said, illegible because of their experimentation and deviation from narrative. These are the people who have never gotten this big publishing contract because their content was already outlawed. So I was reading about Occupy Museums, which is a group that I'm really interested in. I didn't make it to their event at the Whitney on Friday, which was a reading, and I also noticed that the Brooklyn Museum had a reading of the Langston Hughes poem, Let America Be America Again, on Friday. And the Queens Museum was the only major museum in New York City to close explicitly for the J20 strike. And I was really excited to see all the demands that the Occupy Museums made in a value statement that's published on Hyperallergic, and I recommend, if you haven't read it, to read it. And I hope that we see decades from now their demands met, and that it's not just a co-opting of radical politics for inclusion into a biennial. And again, this is about enacting structural change in arts organizations. And I think that includes not saying pay what you wish on the J20 day, which Friday the Whitney says pay what you wish, which assumes that the you of that is, there's like a wistful desire with your money as opposed to that it's just about what you want to pay, which assumes that you need to evaluate or justify your financial status in order to enter through the threshold from the public space into the private space of the museum. And I would really love for museums to just say that it's free. Anyway, so I've been also paying attention to when art institutions are inviting poets and writers, but not supporting their work as thoroughly as they do visual artists who they house and commission. And I have just sort of expressed a sort of suspicion to how writers can be marginalized within museums and are treated like decoration in ways that other marginal subjects to a white male canon are treated as sort of decoration. So those are some rambling thoughts that I had, and I just want to sort of end with thinking about this word dissonance, to borrow from the Black Toot Collective's 1999 manifesto. And I think that looking at this weekend, we're faced with words that are very wide-reaching and diverge, and there's different multitudes within this word. Thinking about the Women's March in relationship to all the thinking I did around the word queer. And I think we need to welcome dissonance when using the word queer to talk about art. And yeah, I read this Instagram. Okay, here it is. So I was on Instagram a lot, trying to understand what the hell's going on. And Noam Parnas wrote this really brilliant text as a sort of long caption to this sign. Vaginas might belong to people of all genders. Remember that men can have pussies, that women can have dicks, that gender nonconforming and non-binary people might have one or the other, and that folks of all genders might have both. I'm saying we should keep fighting for abortion rights and sex education and proper healthcare access for all, but just remember that these don't only apply to women, that women's bodies can truly be all bodies. And I'm going to read just this one other quote. This is Asada Shakur. Constructive criticism and self-criticism are extremely important for any revolutionary organization. Without them, people tend to drown in their mistakes, not learn from them. And I was really racking my brain to think of the best phrase for a sign this weekend, and I thought I arrived at one. Don't erase the record. And on Saturday, I woke up and the US.gov had deleted all mention of climate change and civil rights and our history of murder and theft of Native Americans and their land. And that's not that different than most textbooks that already exist in this country. And I think with my book, I wanted to create a record that I didn't see exist. And it's a very incomplete record. So I was thinking about records. And then I was on the phone with my best friend, Jess, and he asked me, but how can we go from having a record to having justice? Which I thought was a really brilliant question, especially when the record can fall into the hands of the state. And how social media feeds are sort of like automatic FBI files. And I ended up I was listening to Democracy Now's live coverage of the DC March on Washington as I was in the very last minute making my sign, and I ripped apart an old t-shirt and had a Sharpie marker, and it was skidding across the fabric, and I was all of a sudden changed the text of my sign at the last minute, and I changed it to say anti-racist trans dyke ready to resist. And I was aware that this seemed perhaps contradictory to a lot of the arguments of my book, and I felt excited about that. And then I started to have this whole range of emotions. I pinned it to my jacket so I don't really have to take it off, even though it's already starting to fade and blur and become weather damaged. And I'm a little nervous about getting beat up in my neighborhood, and I'm gotta take the self-defense class. And I sort of hear Fox News coming from the laundry vents in Ridgewood. And my neighborhood also, I have a barber who's a religious Jew, and we talk a lot about the role of women in religious Judaism, which I have a lot of strong feelings about, and I have an audience at the barber shop, which is pretty awesome. And he totally tolerates me and gives me the best haircut I've ever had for $13. And I haven't gotten beat up yet, but somebody did talk to me on the L platform going home on Sunday night, and we had an amazing conversation and connected, and it felt really powerful. And I just wanted to end with that. Thank you so much. And I look forward to your questions also. Yeah, I think that in your introduction, it was really great because it was talking about messiness, and it was really improvisational, and I depended really a lot on conversation with people. And I'm very, I write about this in the book, and I didn't pull from this section, but I interviewed every queer person I knew, and also the other people that I knew that were involved in art or writing, and this was in 2010. And I was I'm writing a book about labeling art queer. And everyone was always oh, you're writing about queer art. And I'm no, that's what I'm not writing about. And even now, my friend who I've done a trade with dog sitting, she's I'll help you with publicity, and she's your press release doesn't make any sense. And I'm so it's this sort of convoluted thing that mostly I think began with I just like reached out to everyone I knew, and it was embarrassing. Like it was also felt uncool. Like talking about this at the time that I started the book in 2010 felt a little bit like people were being very generous if they'd like have coffee with me and talk to me about their experiences with identifying as a queer person, and that being very active in how they presented their work to the world, like that identification being out there and like, I'm a queer artist and my work's about queerness, versus people like I write about Jocelyn Seidenberg, who kind of does both in her poetry career, so to speak. I hate that word, but who kind of like, it's like they're queer, like if you know them, you know they're queer, but maybe that you wouldn't know that otherwise, right? And I talk about lots of, and I think a lot of it was it was socially, like I figured it out as I was going along. And, you know, honestly, like I read a lot of anthologies, and I at first had all these rules. Like I was like, no queer theory. And then I got really interested in queer theory, because it's kind of like, the book's kind of like queer theory sometimes. So I sort of broke all my rules that I thought I had. It was really hard to finish. Carolyn, I feel like a lot of props to you for staying with me through it. So yeah, I don't know. Like it was like, it had to be yanked out of my hands, basically. So the process was really intense, yeah. And everything afterwards feels surreal. Yeah, I removed sections, and I also, like, that was painful too, because like there's people where, like I remember I had this moment where I wrote about, Sharon Hayes had this piece called Yard that was in the Marble Cemetery, and when I started writing this book, like Sharon Hayes wasn't like a famous sort of, or she didn't like have like a solo show at the Whitney or like all of these like modes of visibility within the art world. And I really loved this piece, I still do, and I think it's really relevant to like signs today, but it was all these like political signs in the Marble Cemetery. And Marble Cemetery in the East Village is like not open to the public, but then I think it was a collaboration with a gallery and maybe even Creative Time or something like that. And don't quote me on it, even though this is going on the internet. Yeah, and I cut that section. I cut a lot of things, and I think it was because, you know, once I found out about like the third person writing a dissertation on Sharon Hayes that was being turned into book, I thought, yeah, maybe I won't include that. But it also didn't fit. Like a lot of things just didn't flow. So it wasn't, but I think about that. I mean, I just had a drink with someone who's like writing a review about the book, and she said there's no argument. And I said, no, there is an argument. It's like, describe things. Don't just call them things. Like, spend a lot of time staring at them. And so I think there's a lot of like sort of hesitating towards like exploring the reverse of something, right? Which I think is like, perhaps I've been teaching like critical thinking too long, right? Where I'm like, I'm obsessed with the counter argument. A lot of the ideas over the course of me writing this would change and expire. Like when I started writing the book, like talking about like, why are you using the word queer in your artist statement, and why are you not using the word queer in your bio? Like that question, right? Was like, people were like, what? Like, why do you want to talk about that? And then like in 2013, like Carlos Mota had like a roundtable about this in Malin Arnell's Oncoming Corner series. So it was like the inbox, you know, like my inbox was like a light with like a kind of version of my question, but in a different context, because his project, the Nefandis film series, it's much more about like Western colonialism and imperialism. But thinking about the word queer is like not an international export. So a lot of my ideas became like, you know, I felt like they became normal, or like the questions that were sort of like the thorns in the side. So I watched a lot of my like writing sort of expire, or I think the biggest change that I'm still, and maybe it's because I need a lot of time to think about something, and I want to encourage that sort of slow thinking, although I feel like I got to be a little quicker right now, was after Orlando. And I think that a lot of the book is like theory. In some ways, I mean, there's real connections and there's real narratives and there's real conversations that happen and real experiences that I had reading work and thinking about work that I record. But, you know, I write about Queer Nation's manifesto, and then after Orlando, I went to a Queer Nation town hall meeting at the center in June, and it was in, you know, trying to figure out a direct action to respond to gun violence in the United States, which is an issue that does not only affect queer people. And it's a very multifaceted issue with Omar Mateen and the Orlando shooting and this massacre, because it has a lot to do with US imperialism, it has a lot to do with the availability of weapons, war weapons, and also the prison system. This was a prison guard. And so I just thought a lot about, like, I don't know, like, I'm never gonna walk into a queer bar or a gay bar or a space that's a queer space and have it be this, like, intellectual sort of question of what does it mean for communities to gather, like, who's included, who's excluded, which is like the book. Now I'm thinking about, like, mass murder, right? And specifically the murder of Latinx people, right? And so the experience that I had at this Queer Nation meeting was I was like totally disillusioned. I was like, these people are like out of touch. You know, like it was like not multiracial, it was not intergenerational, and it was like a reunion for their ACT UP days. And on top of all of that, privatization is like, has been happening before, like massive, massive amounts of privatization are about to happen. They were passing the hat to raise money to pay for the room. The LGBT Center was not giving them the room for this town hall meeting, and the price tag on their big room on the top floor is $400 for a 2-hour meeting. So I was just like, whoa, like this is, you know, this isn't like reading a manifesto in the library and being like, yeah, like it's, you know, like, okay, like we got to make this, like not, we have to change this space in some way. So yeah, I think a lot of it, and this is what we were talking about, is like figuring out how to restructure my time and my lifestyle to be able to do more like unglamorous direct action activism and learn how to do it. Like I'm a writer and a teacher and an artist. Like I'm not a professional activist, and I need to like get with the fucking program and like follow people who have been doing that. So I think that's like kind of all I've been thinking. I just feel like I don't even know what I'm saying anymore. I've been up here for a while. Oh, but I do want to, I was planning, there was a point in my lecture where I had like a slide that I wanted to show. And people who have been to like my readings before know that I do this, but I'm not like taking off my clothes, don't worry. I have a t-shirt on. But I just did want to show, because I write about in the book that Essex Hemphill had this shirt called Fag Club. And I just want to say, Essex Hemphill, I write about this essay that he writes about wearing a t-shirt that said Fag Club on it. And he's like, forgot that he was even wearing the shirt, and he was like in a supermarket in like his neighborhood, and like some kid was like, there's a faggot in the store. And he was like, oh no. And it's like late 80s or early 90s, like that era. And then the kid was like so excited because he's like, my cousin's gay. And so again, it's like this thing of like connection. But I did get this t-shirt made after Leslie Feinberg died 2 years ago. I don't even remember exactly. Anyway, it's Leslie Feinberg and Minnie Bruce Pratt, who are two heroes of mine, writers, activists, and yeah, I like wearing this shirt when I have to do public presentations because I feel like they're like with me. So that's maybe my final thing, yeah. But also, I should say, I did want to say that Sean D. Henry Smith, who's a photographer and a poet, took my picture that I used for the flyer for this event. And I just wanted to say, Sean D. Henry Smith, his work is amazing, and I love that picture of me. And this photograph is taken by Robert Gerard, who did an amazing archive of photographs of lesbian and gay writers. And this is like a duo portrait. And his book, Particular Voices, is like a whole archive. That's it.